I'd like to begin by thanking Janadas and the IPS family for giving me the privilege of chairing the first panel. Janadas is a modest man. If I were still director of IPS, I would have shamelessly claimed credit for holding Perspectives today, 2 days after the Punggol East by-election. Janadas, Heng Chi and I would like to take exception to one point you made in your remarks. You said no one had foreseen a future for Singapore outside of Malaya, and that the only scenario was to be part of Malaya. Actually, Heng Chi and I both opposed merger, and we both wrote that there was a future for Singapore outside of merging with Malaya. So I think history has vindicated our view. I want to say that moderating this panel is very meaningful to me because Professor Chan, Professor Mahbubani, and I have all three of us love IPS. Heng Chi was the founding director of IPS, and Kishore was for many years on the board of governors of the Institute, even before the merger. And I have had the privilege of serving both as the director and chair. So this is very meaningful to all three of us. But for me, it's a great privilege to moderate. I don't know whether to call this a clash of two titans or a love duet. But in any case, it will be an intellectual feast for all of us. Heng Chi is probably our most brilliant diplomat. And Kishore is without question our most famous public intellectual. So it's a great pleasure for me. It's true. I mean, he's the only person in all this exclusive list of global thinkers. So it gives me a very great pleasure to invite Heng Chi to speak to us.
Thank you very much, Tommy. That was a very diplomatic introduction. Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. I have to say, Janadas, it is a sobering thought, Janadas. It's a sobering thought that when you listed this first session, the Residual, you promptly put Tommy Koh, Chan Heng Chi, and Kishore Mahbubani on it. I thought, what? Are we the leftovers, you know? I have a paper today. I finished it and submitted it on January 14 because this Davos wala called Kishore Mahbubani wanted the paper before he left for his conference. And as a result, it wasn't even before nomination day, and it did not take in January 26. But I think I got the trajectory right, and so I would ask a journalist or whoever has the paper to check against delivery. Now let me begin with two observations. Observation one. History, to a large extent, explains why countries have particular political traditions, why they hold certain values dear, and why they develop characteristic responses and reflexes. Over time, countries and people develop habits of the heart and of the mind. There is the American political model, identifiable American values and reflexes. And even though administrations change, different parties take over, the American political model remains, and the political reflexes are quite predictable. The Second Amendment spells out the right to bear arms, introduced in 1791. Today, after so many cases of shootings in schools and the groundswell of anti-gun feelings, it is still hard to take that right away. The gun lobby is strong, and President Obama and all those who want to do something about the senseless killings can only talk of outlawing certain specific types of guns and introducing more stringent checks. And even that is pushed back. So President Obama, is talking of using a presidential decree if he cannot push through the new law. Then there's the Chinese Communist model. The CCP underwent change with Deng Xiaoping's 4 modernizations. Ideology weakened, some would say evaporated, but the party remains strong. Many of the reflexes and traditions remain. But change does occur and must occur as a country develops. Change, and sometimes rapid fundamental change. America had its countercultural revolution triggered by the Vietnam War. There were some major social value changes, especially with the women's movement, also Black Power. Authority was profoundly challenged and questioned. There was societal change, but in the end, the American political and governing model remained more or less the same, though the political culture changed quite significantly. Change in a political model seems to lag behind change in political culture. I go into some length about the United States because it is a country I have come to know. I also find it helpful when I think about history and political change to reflect on other countries. And then there's the case of Arab Spring, which can disrupt a model and overthrow institutions. But revolutions are often followed by a period of adjustment, often long and difficult, and even then, some core values and reflexes can resurface. So that's point 1. Second observation. Every country claims exceptionalism. President Obama reminded Americans that when they think of themselves as an exceptional country and talk of American exceptionalism, they should remember the French too claim exceptionalism. And there is German exceptionalism, South African exceptionalism, and so on. But I would speak of Singapore exceptionalism, for in many ways we are an exceptional country. I say this not to be proud or arrogant, but to recognize that we are sui generis, unique, of its own kind. We are an unlikely nation. You heard Janadas. You'll hear this many times today. We are an unlikely nation, a city-state nation-state, the only city-state nation-state in the world, a micro-state that has developed the furthest, I would say, the strategy of small state survival. We needn't have developed this way. A successful country with a record of enviable growth over more than 4 decades. It could have gone the other way. We are a small country that gets things done. Americans tell me that. And diplomats in Singapore tell me that, you know, when we say we want to change the education system, how many times have we done education reform to get it better? In other countries, they spend a great deal of time arguing about things, and nothing or very little gets done. I just read in an Economist Intelligence Unit, EIU, global survey, in which people were asked where they would like to be born in, which country they would like to be born in. And Singapore ranked number 6. All the Nordic countries ranked near the top. EIU concluded that people wanted to be born in a country that is small, peaceful, homogeneous, and a liberal democracy. But Singapore surprised them completely. Why is Singapore the way it is? What is the political model we have developed, and what are our governing reflexes and our national shared values? In the post-2011 GE Singapore, there is a great deal of talk of change that is needed. There are those who focus on policy changes they would like to see. But there is a segment that want to see change in the political model into a Western-style democracy with a two-party system. This session was planned to let us reflect on the Singapore situation. what we are, why we are what we are, and where we will be heading to. I began by saying historical circumstances shape values and traditions and the governing models. And you know our history. I'll go quickly through it because I think some of you did not really do history in school. And Jana Das has touched on some of these points. In 1965, Singapore achieved independence unexpectedly. Survival was the issue front and center. Singaporeans could feel it. What would our future be? What next? We had no natural resources except for our people and our location. No oil, no minerals, no forests, no water, and hardly any airspace to speak of. As you well know, Singapore pilots fly up and out is quite tricky. We had just lost our hinterland. We are not a normal country. Moreover, the immediate regional context was a hostile one. Separation from Malaysia was accompanied by explosive racial rhetoric and sentiments. Indonesia under Sukarno was pursuing confrontasi against Singapore and Malaysia, complete with commando landings. We were at our most vulnerable. The PAP government defined its first task as ensuring the territorial and economic survival of Singapore. The defense and foreign policy emphasized Singapore as a non-aligned country, but accompanied with British bases because of the security context. And within a matter of 2 years, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and Singapore, we formed ASEAN. So right from the start, Singapore was established as independent, non-aligned, but more pro-West, and believing in multilateralism. To build the economy, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, the cabinet secretaries, ministers, and civil servants went around the world securing foreign investments. They learned that political stability was the first condition foreign investors requested. And in the 50s and 60s, as you know, Singapore went through a rather turbulent phase, contentious politics, student riots, strikes, and racial politics. Political debate was heated, passionate, battle for merger, followed by racial politics during the short Malaysian period. And our leaders of that generation, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, Toh Chin Chai, thought establishing political stability was the first order of the day. And I recall Prime Minister Lee's words at that time when he spoke to trade unions. Don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Pragmatism was a lesson we learned of necessity. There was a sense of grave urgency, almost emergency, to get the economy going. The Barisan Socialists, the largest party, opposition party, took the decision to boycott parliament. They said we had phony independence. It was also the line of the Communist Party of Malaya. And so 1968's election was considered a phony election. But it turned out to be a historical mistake. Once out, it was hard for the opposition to come back in. It was not till 1981 that J.B. Jeyaretnam won back a seat in the Anson by-election for the opposition. So without even working for it, the PAP got its first one-party parliament. They found it was quicker to implement policies and get necessary things done to face the emerging challenges. They liked it. And so there were many challenges, you know, British withdrawal announced in 68, came in 70. There was a sense in the first generation leaders that life is tough, we are vulnerable, and we don't have many options. And you hear this throughout. The governing party played hardball to maintain the one-party dominance. But they delivered on their performance. High growth, jobs were created, national service was introduced, education expanded, and Singapore's home-owning policy was launched. Singaporeans gave the PAP government their support election after election. The political model fostered was one that facilitated quick policy making and implementation. It rested on a dominant one-party system promoting consensus and an overall depoliticization of issues. In my earlier writings, I described ours as an administrative state. I've used the word an authoritarian government. But it was soft authoritarianism, soft compared to the other tigers, ROK, Republic of Korea, and Taiwan at that time, because they were hard military regimes. There was clear leadership, and Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was aided by a strong bureaucracy with technocratic emphasis. Institutions were built to invite grassroots participation, CCC, town councils, and feedback sessions. And there were criticisms that the feedback flowed up, but the policies did not change. Singapore's democracy is based on the Westminster model, but it is not an exact copy. Farid Zakaria described Singapore as an illiberal democracy. We have regular elections, free elections, but not the freedoms he expects of a liberal democracy. I have described Singapore as a tight democracy because democracy is elastic. More democracy, less democracy. I think after 2011 and seeing the by-elections, I would say we are moving towards a normal democracy. From the beginning, PAP leaders enumerated specific values which were considered fundamental if we were to survive as a nation. These were and still remain respect for multiracialism, multilingualism, multi-religions, which implies seditious attacks on any race, language, or religion would not be tolerated. Maintenance of law and order, meritocracy, and non-corruption. The three multis and belief in democracy had a critical meaning in 1965. It differentiated us from Malaysia. That was why we separated. There were two visions of a nation, and separation was a contest of these two visions, equality of the races or preferential treatment for one ethnicity. Singaporeans now, I believe, have embraced these values, though now and again there are criticisms that the implementation falls short of the ideal. These have become our national values. For sure, Singaporeans would not tolerate living in a disorderly and chaotic country where law and order is weak. And there is a debate going on right now about meritocracy and its unintended effects. Yet, I do not think Singaporeans will agree on dropping the principle altogether, because any alternative would be worse. We debate to make implementation better. On the economic front, given our size constraints and the small population, Singapore had to be an open economy linked to the world. We have no hinterland, and in 1973, it was 72 actually, Janadas, Mr. Rajaratnam said in a flash of brilliance, the world is our hinterland. So we grasped the idea of being a global city in the 70s, and before globalization was a buzzword. But I thought that was a very thoughtful point put on the table by Janadas in his opening remarks about what sort of global city we should be and what should globalization mean for Singapore. Over the years, PAP leaders have modified their political style, but not the political model. It was a paradigm that worked. Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong's leadership was more approachable and different from Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. And Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has evolved his own style, part compassion, part firm leadership. With both leaders, Singapore's political space opened gradually. The success of the governing model and the policies is reflected in the positive changes in our population. So the ground has changed and expectations have changed. The census data between 1970 and 2010 showed Singapore's demographics have been reshaped. You keep reading in the papers today, the middle class is squeezed out, the working class, the middle class that feels tight, and there's the elite. Well, I invite you to look at some of the census data as I think is relevant for the political discussion. Singaporeans today are better educated, university educated, overseas educated, and holding better jobs. The success of PAP policies over time was that you see the ground changing, and it is game changing. Compare the educational profiles. In 1970, those who had tertiary education was 1.3%, 1970, when roughly the time we began. By the year 2000, those with tertiary education was 22.8%, tertiary defined as diploma, professional qualifications, or university. And in 2010, it was 37.6%, almost 38%. Then look at occupation, what people work as. What I call the PMET, Professional Managers, Executive and Technicians Group, has grown. In 1970, it was 11%. In the year 2000, the PMET group is 43.5%. And in 2010, half of Singapore's population is PMET, professionals, managers, executives, and technicians. The production, the workers, in 1970 was like 39.2%, production and related workers. That group has fallen to 54% in 2010, but they emerge as something else. You have plant and machine operators, and now there's a new category called cleaners, laborers, and related workers. The population with tertiary education in Singapore, as I pointed out, in 2010 was 37.6%. And for those in the age group 25 years to 34 years, 70.7% or 71% had acquired tertiary education. Now this is very different. And of those who studied at the university level, half of them studied locally and half of them studied overseas. In the year 2000, 48% of those doing tertiary education studied locally. 52% studied overseas. That's huge. In 2010, it was reversed. 52% studied locally, more universities, SUTD, SMU, and all the other polytechnics came up. 48% went overseas, so it's half and half. So when you say middle class, it's what kind of middle class? What do they want? It's not just cost of living is high. Have their ideas changed? So that's important. The general election of May 2011 was a watershed. A critical mass of voters sent a message to the governing party. They want a stronger opposition presence in Parliament. The vote went 60-40 roughly. And more than 1 in 4 voters were in the age group 21 to 34 years of age. 8.5% of the electorate were first-time voters. There were issues: rising cost of living, inflation, income inequality, influx of foreigners causing job displacement, particularly among the PMET group, and the lowering of wages. The social media revolution also gave voice to and amplified the dissatisfaction and the opposition views. It is true that Singaporeans are now more vocal, more demanding of their rights, and they want their views heard. They have lost their fear for speaking up, and voting for the opposition. Politics has become competitive again. The political culture has altered, transformed, has been repoliticized. Now, the ruling party, the PAP, responded swiftly. They were in a listening mode. They recognized the social contract was broken and there was to be a new consensus if they are going to win back their dominance. And in introducing the Singapore National Conversation, the government is seeking to provide an avenue for the people to express their views, and not just the politically active or social media savvy. The national conversation has shown that people want different things, and sometimes they are contradictory. So our consensus has to be a negotiated consensus. But Prime Minister Lee on November 25th clarified to PAP party activists. He said, "We are not asking people, what are your views? I will go and I will be your note taker and speak on your behalf. I think we have ideals, we have ideas, we have policies, and we have proposals. And it is our responsibility to lead that discussion together with people in order to persuade people to see things more the way we do." I think the PAP knows it has to find the new balance, but it faces the classic dilemma. Do you get rid of a model and a set of policies that have worked and in many ways continue to be relevant? The existential context of Singapore has not basically changed. The vulnerabilities are still there, though they may be in a different form. Today is not about survival, but keeping competitive or risk irrelevance. And policies relating to our founding values of multiracialism, multilingualism, multi-religions, law and order, non-corruption and meritocracy, and an open economy should not be given up, or we will be diminished or destroyed. That's my view. These are first-order policies. But there are other policies which I consider second-order policies, such as COEs, foreign talent, housing prices, and what creates high cost of living. These are policies which should be reviewed and improved. I read a very nuanced piece by Jeremy Au, a young journalist in Straits Times today. I like to meet young people nowadays because I need to find out what they think and to keep up with them. I've been away for 16 years. I read them very religiously. I read the blogs too. He was writing about politics in 2030, and Jeremy Au argues, if there is a consensus about the trajectory of Singapore politics, it is that there is an unstoppable drift towards liberalization. And for some, the true mark of Singapore's arrival is the establishment of a two-party system. But Au also points out that a poll in NUS recently of some 400 students found no clear desire among the young for a two-party system. So how long will the present model of a dominant party government last? I think this will depend on what the PAP does in terms of policies, retaining its support, if it continues to recruit good political talent, not just high qualifications, but also people with good political skills. It also depends on how well the opposition parties do in recruiting talent and formulating an alternative set of policies and programs. But we do not know also what coming challenges there will be in the external context, and that could impose on our political environment, because that will count majorly. One thing is clear, and this we see in the elections of January 26th, the by-election. Singaporeans know what the PAP has done to build up Singapore. They do not worry about sovereignty, territorial integrity, and even the economic future of Singapore. They take all that for granted. What the bulk of voters ask of the governing party is, what have you done for me today? And others see they want a different kind of government, a government where there's a strong presence of the opposition in Parliament. So going forward, the legacy is important, but it will be a competitive fight for support. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to follow a good Asian tradition and begin with an apology. But it's a genuine apology. My plane landed at 5:30 a.m. from Zurich, coming straight back from Davos. So if I yawn, it's not because your question is boring. It's natural. My body is telling me it's 2:15 in the morning now. Tommy described the long association that Heng Chi and he and I have had. He could have also added that when he left his post as ambassador to the UN in 1984, I took over from him. And in 1989, when I left New York, Heng Chi took over from me. So the three of us have shared destinies for a long time. I also want to begin by saying that I think we all know in this room, and I actually agree with Tommy, that Janata should claim full credit for having seen the future and knowing that this is probably the most interesting day of the year to discuss politics in Singapore. Because there's absolutely no doubt, I think Heng Chi also emphasized this in her paper, that Singapore is going through a political transition of some kind. But I want to add, and I can say this with some conviction, having just landed from Davos, that most parts of the world are also undergoing some kind of political transition. I mean, you can look at the Arab Spring, or some call it the Arab Winter, as an extreme. You can even look at what's happening in even United States and UK and elsewhere. The whole world's changing. In fact, a week from today, actually, I'll be in a podium in New York launching my new book, The Great Convergence. And one of the themes of that book is that the size of the global middle class is exploding. And this is why I'm glad that Heng Chi gave the statistics on middle class in Singapore. But if you look at Asia, the size of the middle class today in Asia is about 500 million. In 2020, in just 8 years from now, the middle class is going to grow from 500 million to 1.75 billion, an increase of 3.5 times. And when you have such a massive increase, you're bound to see political changes. So what Singapore is experiencing now in trying to deal with the new assertive middle class is what the region and the world is also experiencing. I also agree with the broad premise that Janadas has given to us, which is that the residual does matter. The values that we have inherited, the history we have gone through, does determine where we are heading. And I think Heng Chi did a brilliant job of describing our history, what's happened to us. But one interesting point that actually Heng Chi didn't mention in the paper, but it came out in her verbal presentation, which shows I was paying attention, Heng Chi. She said Singapore's system was described as soft authoritarian. And then she added in her verbal remarks, it is clear that post-2011, and certainly post-last Saturday, we're now, as she said in her words, a normal democracy. Now, you do not go overnight from a soft authoritarian system to a normal democracy. It takes time. There is a transitional period, a transitional process. An interesting question that's worth discussing here today is how it happened and why it happened, because that's the directions that we are heading towards. But the best way actually of understanding what is powerful in the residual element in Singapore's political culture is to project it forward, to look ahead and see where will the residual take us to. Of course, we all know none of us can predict the future. In fact, there's a wonderful Arab proverb which says, "He who speaks about the future lies, even when he tells the truth." But at the same time, as emphasized, in fact, in the PRISM exercise, scenario planning does help. It does help to think of alternative futures, because indeed, one way of actually preventing a future you do not want is to actually build a scenario or what is it you're trying to avoid. So I thought that the best way of trying to figure out how the residual will play out in the future is to think of three possible scenarios that might come Singapore's way. And the first scenario, which I think is probably I would describe as the most probable scenario, and I describe it as soft landing from soft authoritarianism. And in a sense, this is what you're seeing happening in Singapore today, which is that we still remain peaceful, prosperous, still economically growing and do well. But I think if we are going to continue doing well, there's one fundamental point in Heng Chi's paper that I completely agree with. And on page 8, she lists out what she sees as the fundamental values that the PAP generated for Singapore. And this is how she describes them. 1, respect for multiracialism, multilingualism, and multi-religions. 2, maintenance of law and order. 3, meritocracy. 4, non-corruption. Now, these are fundamental values. And if we have genuinely and in a very profound fashion almost sort of injected this into our DNA, these values. And the good news, I think, is that we more or less have. Then the likelihood is that Singapore will continue to do well and gradually transform. There'll be more space for the political opposition. They may win a few more seats. But by and large, the scenario that Singapore has seen of a dominant party that drives Singapore forward is likely to be the one that will carry on. And that, I say, is the most probable scenario. But we also know that we live in a world of great surprises. And here, I must say, one of the most valuable things that I learned from my first, the boss I worked for as foreign minister, Mr. Rajaratnam, and he used to say this to us almost weekly in our weekly meetings with him in the foreign ministry. He said, "Kishore, we must always think the unthinkable. Because as we now know, the unthinkable happens." And so to sort of think about the unthinkable, let me suggest 2 other scenarios that could happen in Singapore. The second scenario I describe as hard landing. And what is a hard landing? To understand what a hard landing is like, is actually very easy. Because if you look all over Asia, We've had so many dominant parties that were in office for decades, and then each and every one of them had a hard landing. Indeed, each and every one of them was voted out of office before voted back into office. And of course, I'm talking about the Congress in India, long dominant, went out, came back, got re-elected recently. I'm talking about the LDP in Japan, went out, came back. Or the Kuomintang in Taiwan. So if you see that the pattern in Asia is one of dominant parties losing power, then the question you have to ask is, can it happen here too? And that's why it's important to ask ourselves, what is it led to these kinds of changes, and how do we prevent it? And interestingly, by the way, we should watch very, very carefully the coming elections in Malaysia. I just happened to see Prime Minister Najib in Davos, and it's very clear, talking to his delegation, that they know that these elections in Malaysia will be a very tough election. Now, I still think that the Barisan Nasional is going to win. But is there a possibility of it losing? The answer is yes. And that possibility never existed before. So that's a sign of how political change is coming in a fundamental way. So what's the third scenario? Third scenario, also improbable, but one that we, again, cannot rule out because it is happening today in the most advanced democracies. And what is this third scenario? Political gridlock and paralysis. You see this certainly in the two most advanced democracies. You see this in some ways in the United Kingdom. Of course, it does have a government in place and so on and so forth. But I can tell you that my British friends tell me in private that they're horrified at the prospect of having a referendum 5 years from now on whether the UK should leave the EU, because it creates 5 years of enormous uncertainty with investors asking, am I investing in one country or in 27 countries? And that's the kind of paralysis that is affecting the most advanced democracy, UK. Even more strikingly, the largest, not the largest, but the longest democracy, the United States of America, as we all know, is undergoing a remarkable paralysis. And this morning, as I landed at 5:30 a.m., after the plane had taxied to a stop, I turned on my BlackBerry. Just saying, I didn't disobey the rules. And I read an essay that someone sent to me by Ken Rogoff, a Harvard economist, whom I just met in Davos, actually. And this is what he says in paragraph 1. Most foreign observers look at the US budget shenanigans with confusion and dismay, wondering how a country that seems to have it all can manage its fiscal affairs so chaotically. The root problem is not just a hugely elevated level of public debt or a patently unsustainable trajectory for old age entitlements. The root problem is an electorate deeply divided over the directions of government, with differences compounded by changing demographics and sustained sluggish growth. So the longest democracy in the world is now going through some remarkable gridlock and paralysis. So if it can happen to the United States of America, how can a small country like Singapore be immune from it? Which is why, frankly, a conference like this is actually very timely. It's clear that we are going through a political transition. It's clear that the world is going through political transitions, and it is our duty to try and analyze them as best as we can and then prepare for all kinds of futures. And as Rajaratnam would have said, think the unthinkable. Thank you.